Have you ever been in a meeting, maybe a corporate training session, or even just a tense dinner, where the topic of race comes up and you can just feel the air leave the room?
Oh, absolutely. That physical shift. It's almost universal in modern conversations.
It is. Shoulders tense up, people stop making eye contact, and almost always someone gets defensive. Maybe someone even starts to cry or just completely shuts down.
It's that distinctive, suffocating feeling when the stakes suddenly feel incredibly high, but nobody seems to know the rules anymore.
Exactly. And our first thought is usually, is that person just being difficult? Are they too sensitive?
Right, a personal failing.
But the book we're looking at today just flips that whole script. It asks a much more provocative
A
question.
much more challenging one.
What if that defensiveness isn't a personal quirk at all? What if it's actually a weaponized tool, something designed to keep the racial hierarchy exactly as it is?
It's a disturbing thought, but one we really have to sit with. We are looking at white fragility. Why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism by the sociologist DiAngelo.
And this book was absolutely everywhere after the 2020 protests. It became the handbook for HR departments, for university seminars, for reading groups across the globe.
It had a massive cultural impact.
It really did. But before we get into the heavy lifting, I need to mention something special about this deep dive.
Go ahead.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Which is great because it lets us process a huge amount of critique and synthesis very quickly. And believe me, we are going to need it today.
Because DiAngelo's central argument is it's dense.
It is. She argues that white fragility is a specific pattern. It's the anger, the guilt, the fear, the silence, all the things white people display when their complicity in racism gets called out.
And the whole point of this pattern.
The function, she says, is to restore what she calls racial comfort.
Racial comfort. That's a really sticky phrase, isn't it?
It is. It suggests that the status quo is, by default, comfortable for white people, and any real challenge to it feels like a literal attack.
So the fragility is the defense mechanism for that comfort.
It's the gatekeeper. The argument is that this fragility prevents any real progress because it forces people of color to stop talking about the actual issue.
And instead, focus on calming the white person down.
Exactly.
So our mission here is not just to summarize the book. Plenty of people have done that. We want to apply a really rigorous critique.
Right. We want to see if this book offers what we'd call actual knowledge, or it's more like a strongly argued opinion.
We're going to test its logic, its ethics.
We'll be looking at it through an Adlerian lens and testing it against something as fundamental as the golden rule. Does this book really help us form a more perfect union, or does it risk driving us further apart?
Okay, so let's start with the core claims. Because DiAngelo uses words we all think we know, like racism and whiteness, but she redefines them.
And that's the first big hurdle for readers. If you go into this book thinking racism just means being a mean person or hating someone for their skin color, you're going to be completely lost.
So what is her definition?
For DiAngelo, racism is not about individual meanness. It's not about whether you personally are a bad person with hate in your heart. She defines it as the water we swim in.
It's the systemic default.
Precisely. So in her framework, a white person saying I'm not racist is kind of like a fish saying I'm not wet.
It's a meaningless statement because you're already soaked in the system.
Exactly. Because the system, our economy, our media, our history, is set up to advantage white people. She argues you're socialized into it, regardless of your personal intentions.
Which brings us to whiteness.
Right. She sees it not just as the skin color, but as a specific location of structural advantage, a position in the hierarchy.
Okay, so if that's the claim,
Yeah.
that every white person is automatically complicit, where's the proof? I mean, I'm the kind of person who likes to see the data. Are there charts, longitudinal studies?
And this is where we have to apply that Adlerian lens we mentioned. Mortimer Adler made this great distinction between knowledge, which is empirical, something you can test and falsify, and understanding.
And understanding is more.
What?
Pattern recognition.
Exactly. Insight. And DiAngelo's evidence is primarily anecdotal. It comes from her decades of work as a diversity trainer.
So she's seeing these patterns repeat in conference rooms and workshops.
Yes. She describes seeing white participants react with shock, with tears, sometimes just walking out of the room when their racial views are challenged.
And the book feels true to a lot of people.
It has what's called high phenomenological plausibility.
That is a heavy
It
phrase.
just means it feels true because it matches our lived experience.
Mm.
I mean, when she describes the white person who cries and suddenly becomes the center of attention, forcing the black people in the room to comfort them,
A lot of people recognize that moment.
it rings a bell. It gives a vocabulary to a dynamic that's usually invisible, or at least unnamed.
But just because something feels true, that doesn't make it scientific fact.
No. And that is the absolute critical distinction here. The book is diagnostic. It's useful for naming a social awkwardness. But critics would argue that systematizing your observations from a workshop isn't the same as rigorous, data-driven social science.
So it's an opinion, a theory, that's been elevated.
I think that's a fair critique. It's an interpretation.
This leads us right into the logic of the book. And this is where things get really, really interesting, and for some readers, incredibly frustrating.
Because there seems to be a logical trap built right into the argument.
It's often called a self-sealing argument.
In logic, we always look for falsifiability. I mean, is there any possible evidence that could prove this theory wrong? With DiAngelo's framework, the answer often appears to be no.
So walk me through that. How does it work in practice?
Okay, imagine you're in one of these trainings. The facilitator suggests you're reacting with white fragility because you seem uncomfortable.
Right.
Now, if you accept that diagnosis, you've just admitted you're fragile and complicit in racism.
Okay, so I agree, and I'm guilty. Simple enough.
Right. But what if you deny it? What if you say, no, I actually just disagree with your premise, or I'm not feeling fragile, I'm feeling like you're mischaracterizing my point?
Well, then what happens?
That denial itself is then classified as more evidence of your fragility.
So, heads you win, tails I lose.
That's the trap. It creates this perfectly circular loop. Any objection to the concept is taken as proof of the concept.
It's a Kafka trap.
It's exactly a Kafka trap, named after the Kafka stories, where you're guilty simply by virtue of being accused. There's no valid way to disagree with the framework without, in the eyes of the person using it, proving the framework right.
That feels dangerous for any kind of open dialogue.
Well, it's what some philosophers call epistemic injustice. It means that one group's testimony about their own internal motives, like, I'm not angry because of race, I'm angry because you're making a huge generalization about me, is automatically discounted.
It's treated as a symptom, not a valid point.
Exactly. The facilitator's interpretation is positioned as the absolute truth, and the participant's reality is just a symptom of their pathology.
It basically stops critical thinking dead in its tracks. You can't debate the ideas if the very act of debating proves you're fragile.
Correct. And that is why we have to be so careful to distinguish between the utility of the book, its ability to help us spot defensiveness, and the logic of the book, which can effectively forbid dissent.
I really want to get into the ethics of this because that circular logic feels like it violates some pretty basic rules of fairness. But before we dive into that and the critique from Black intellectuals, let's just take a breath.
Good idea.
This is heavy stuff. That's why we use Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, inspiring reflection and rational thought. It's so important to have spaces where we can slow down and think, not just react.
Absolutely. Reflection is really the antidote to that kind of reactivity.
Okay, so we've looked at the claims and the logic. Now let's really dig into the ethics. And we have a simple framework for this. The golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
A pretty fundamental test.
So how does white fragility hold up against that?
This is where the critique gets very sharp, particularly from the linguist and cultural critic John McWhorter. He argues that the book, while it's trying to help, actually violates the golden rule by, in his words, infantilizing Black people.
Infantilizing. That's a very strong word. Usually this book is presented as something that empowers Black people.
McWhorter's point is that the book portrays Black people as these exceptionally fragile beings who have to be shielded from any white emotion or any disagreement.
So the implication is, what? That if a white person raises their voice or cries or even just gets angry in a debate,
the Black person in the room will be shattered. That's the subtext he's pointing to.
I see. So it denies Black people their own resilience, their own strength.
Exactly. It denies them full adult agency. It treats them like Fabergé eggs that need constant protection from the normal friction of human interaction. McWhorter asks, if you treat someone as if they can't handle a difficult conversation, are you really treating them as an equal?
And his answer is no.
His answer?
And what about the flip side of that? What does the book's framework do to the white reader?
Well, it risks stripping them of their moral agency. If you are told that you are racist regardless of your intentions, and that achieving a positive white identity is an impossible goal. Where do you go from there?
It just sounds like it leaves you in a state of permanent guilt.
It's confession without absolution. You're left constantly suspicious of your own motives, always checking yourself, but with no clear path to actually being a good person in this framework. It replaces the goal of civic friendship with a relationship of perpetual management.
Managing your own guilt and managing the perceived fragility of others.
That's it.
So that brings us to our preamble test. We always ask, does this idea help form a more perfect union and ensure domestic tranquility?
And it's a mixed bag, but the risks are pretty high. On the one hand, you could argue it establishes justice by naming a real injustice. It points out correctly that the status quo harms people of color.
That's a valid and necessary point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But when it comes to domestic tranquility, that's where it really falters.
How so?
By framing one group, white people, as uniquely fragile and in need of perpetual correction, and the other group as uniquely vulnerable, it can harden polarization.
Yeah.
It doesn't really invite people into a shared project of building a better country together.
It invites them into a power struggle over who gets to define reality in the room.
I think so. It feels like it frames the world as us versus them permanently.
And that can undermine the general welfare, right? If we're so focused on the interpersonal dynamics of a single diversity workshop, who looked at whom the wrong way, we might be diverting energy from making material changes.
Exactly. If I'm spending all my mental energy policing my tone of voice, am I actually doing anything about housing policy or labor rights?
And that's a critique that comes from the left, actually.
It is. Critics like Alex Sherman argue the book completely ignores class. It flattens all white people into one single bucket. So a struggling white coal miner in West Virginia is treated as having the exact same fragility and privilege as a white CEO in Manhattan.
And their relationship to actual power is completely different.
Completely. By ignoring economics, the book implies that the real work of anti-racism is mostly psychological. It's about fixing your internal feelings and your behavior in meetings.
Rather than fixing the external laws that govern wealth and opportunity, it's the HRification of justice.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
Yeah.
It turns a massive political struggle into a workplace management issue.
Okay, so we've hit the logic, the ethics, the politics, but we always want to be fair. We're not here to just trash the book. We're here to mine it for value. What are the real strengths? Because millions of people bought this book for a reason.
And we can't ignore that. It provided a vocabulary for dynamics that were previously invisible. Before this book, if a white person derailed a tense meeting with their tears, it was just an awkward moment.
No.
DiAngelo gave people the tools to say, wait a second, let's look at what's happening here. The conversation has suddenly shifted from the issue of racism to the emotional comfort of this one person.
And that is valuable. It helps you identify when someone is shutting down a conversation just to protect themselves.
It does, and it encourages humility. I mean, the core advice to listen more, to not assume you're objective, to take feedback without exploding, that's just sound advice for anyone in any difficult conversation.
It's basically stop getting defensive and listen. That's good marriage advice too.
It is. The problem isn't the advice to listen. The problem is the logical framework that surrounds that advice.
So let's synthesize this for the listener. They've heard all the buzzwords. They might even have this book on their shelf. How should they actually use it?
I would say use it as a mirror, not as a verdict.
Ooh, I like that. Expand on that for me.
When you are in one of those tense conversations and you feel that heat rising in your chest, that defensiveness, use the book to ask yourself, what am I protecting right now? Am I actually trying to understand, or am I just trying to win?
So it's a tool for self-reflection.
An excellent one. But don't use it as a gavel to judge other people. Don't use it to dismiss someone else's argument just because they're white and they happen to disagree with you. That's where the logic breaks down.
And you have to correct it with other information.
Yes. Correct the book by reading history and economics. You have to understand the structures of inequality, not just the feelings of inequality in a meeting.
So read DiAngelo for the interpersonal dynamics, but read someone else for the systemic analysis.
Read DiAngelo to understand the conflicts room. Read history to understand the neighborhood.
That makes a lot of sense. It feels like we've taken a book that's often treated as either a holy text or a complete heresy.
Depending on who you talk to, yes.
And we've turned it back into just a book, a tool, with strengths and weaknesses.
And that is the whole goal of critical thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
No text is above scrutiny. The book shattered the comfortable illusion that good people can't be complicit in a racist system. That's A massive, important contribution.
Uh,
But its logical flaws and its self-sealing arguments mean we have to keep our thinking caps on. It should be a starting point for inquiry, not a final manual for justice.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that distinction you made between the diagnostic and the scientific. It's great at diagnosing that awkward social pattern, but it's weak as a rigorous social theory.
And for me, I'd add the importance of true reciprocity. Real justice has to recognize the dignity and the agency of all the participants in the conversation. We can't get to a better future by infantilizing one group and pathologizing another. We need a robust adult conversation where real disagreement is allowed.
And that, I think, is the perfect place to land. This book matters, but it's not the final word. It's just part of a much larger, much older conversation about how we all live together.
And we are all still learning how to have that conversation better.
If this deep dive sparked some new thoughts for you, or maybe challenged how you see this book, that's exactly what we're aiming for. We want to thank you for listening to this analysis.
And remember, these conversations are difficult, but avoiding them doesn't fix anything. The goal isn't comfort. The goal is, and always should be, understanding.
Before you go, we have one final provocation for you to think about. The book argues that silence can be a form of violence. But is there a difference between the silence of complicity and the silence of deep reflection? And how can you tell the difference in your own life?
That's the question to carry with you.
Don't forget to check out Mindful Moments and our podcasts for more content like this. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think critically.
We'll see you next time.